thank you for watching the third episode of the podcast. I'm Cassandra Rawheisen, and this is Elizabeth Zielinski. So do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Elizabeth Zielinski, and I am a special education advocate in Fairfax County, Virginia, but I do assist clients nationwide on some specific issues around special education. And I'm also the parent of 2 kids, both of whom are almost adults now. One's close, both of whom had special education services.
Cool. All right. So how did you kind of get into educational advocacy?
Gosh, you know what? If you had told me years ago, it was 2004, when my oldest son, who's now 22, when he was identified as eligible for an IEP, which we'll talk about in a bit what that means. But it was, how long ago is that now? 18 years ago.
Wow.
And if you had told me that, if you had told me then that this is the field I would be in, I'd laugh at you. But I remember at the time thinking, I have resources in the form of time and money and, a certain amount of expertise, and I'm struggling. And so if I'm struggling, what are other people doing who have less to bring to it than I do? And the answer is they're getting lost. So it was maybe about 5 or 6 years ago that I started thinking I could do this for others. And what I've found is that it's my calling. And that's what's so funny to me is that I never would have thought this was the thing. But people used to say, oh, I love my work. It doesn't feel like work. And that's how I feel about it. I love it.
That's really good. Yeah. I mean, as I'm going into college, like not this year, but next year, I want to find something where I feel that same way. I don't want a job and think of it as a job. Yeah. I want something that you have.
And your generation, I think, is better at seeing the value of that. I was 50 before I figured it out. Some people spend their whole lives without figuring out. And that's not wrong either, because you can find your happiness outside of work. But I just didn't think it was possible to feel like I wasn't working. I mean, it is work and it's heavy work, but I'm so invested that it's very validating.
Yeah. I want to find something that I'm like emotionally connected to.
And that's exactly what it is for me. Yes, exactly.
So at one point, I believe you like created a school. Is that correct?
Yeah, I don't know that it's fair to call it a school necessarily, because that implies that it was an accredited program. It was more of like a tutoring center or a co-op.
Okay.
But it came out of a need that was not being met in the public school setting around my son's communication. And there were other families whose needs were also not being met. And so we said, let's just figure out how to do it ourselves. Yeah. It ended up being an incredibly difficult thing to sustain. And what I learned in the process was that I was very, very invested in my son, but I wasn't invested in building a school.
Yeah.
I was only invested in building the school because it's what my son needed. But that 1 degree of removal made it that much more difficult, and it's an enormous task in the best of times.
Yeah.
So that it didn't work out for a lot of reasons, but yes, I did do that.
Okay. Did you ever experience struggles within the IEP system?
What time is it? You mean today?
Yeah.
Yes. In fact, I have. I mean, it's a broken system. It's and schools are places of infinite need and limited means. And so, you often see memes or whatever that say, everybody can have rights. They're not pie, but special education services are pie, and they do run out. And it is often the first place to be cut in budgets, and schools are often the first place to be cut when, tax money is being allocated. So we're fortunate here that we are fairly resource rich.
Yeah.
But other parts of the country, horror stories that I hear. And, this area is not perfect. And I could talk about the challenges that we face here, but it's so far ahead of where most places are. If there weren't struggles, though, I wouldn't have work.
Yeah. So, like, for parents, because this podcast is, like, informational for parents who are struggling within the IEP system, I really wanted to, like, crack down on, like, the inner workings of, like, the IEP system. And I feel like you would be the best person to talk about, and you probably know.
So I think, it is a complicated system. And I have a couple of pieces of advice that I think change the game a little bit. I think that because what I mentioned a moment ago about schools having this infinite need, one of the ways they fill that need is, I hesitate to go so far as to say it's manipulation, but I do think that parents are left feeling powerless oftentimes. And there's reasons why that is that are legitimate, because in some ways the system is stacked against the parent's voice. Some of it's because the parent cannot be, of all the biases that the human mind deals with on a daily basis, the bias that for your children is one of the most powerful. And so, even if all things were equal, the investment is different. I don't diminish the fact that, teachers, they don't go into their work for, big paychecks, easy money, short hours. They do it because they genuinely care. And that is the baseline. And I absolutely get that. But nobody cares about their job the way a parent cares about their child.
Right.
Nobody, nor should they care about their job that much. And so right there, that's a power imbalance. The outcome matters more to the parent. And that's not to say it doesn't matter to the teacher. Absolutely not. I would never say that. But the investment's different. And so understanding exactly where your power is, even if you don't bring an advocate, bring a friend, somebody who can filter what's being said through that lens of objectivity. The sweet spot is somebody, and what I think I bring to the table is because I have children that had IEPs, I can deeply empathize with the experience parents are having. But with my training and with the fact that it's not my child, I get that one degree of objectivity. That's really important. There's certain documents that they'll put you to sleep to read.
Yeah.
But you have to do it because the answers are all there. I mean, the day doesn't pass that a family doesn't say to me, how did you know this? And it's like, well, because it's in this document that I read that they give you at every meeting. Of course, I don't put it quite that way,
Right.
But it's hard to read. I get it. And the person who writes the document, having a legal background myself, the person who writes the document holds more power.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so, I get it. I do, but you have to.
Right.
The other piece of advice I would say is be very clear on what the areas of expertise are around the table. So you have somebody who's there to interpret test results. You have somebody there who's the classroom teacher. You have somebody there who's an administrator. The specific expertise you bring to the table is that unique nuance that is your child. There's no other person that can bring that.
Yeah.
And then lastly, I would say that collaboration is a byproduct. It's not a thing unto itself. Collaboration is a byproduct of mutual respect and the dignity that you convey to one another. And these are habits that don't exist in isolation. They have to go both ways.
Yeah.
And if they exist, they are, the baseline. They're the base of the pyramid that leads you to a collaborative outcome.
Yeah. I would definitely agree with the second point that you made with my mom, because she's been fighting ever since I was very, very young.
I know.
Yeah. And
I've helped her a few times. I know.
She without my mom, there's no way I would be in the position that I am right now. And I'm very, very thankful for her, because I know not every parent has the bandwidth to deal with that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But by the same token, it doesn't take training to know your child.
Yeah.
Well, it does, but nothing that any parent hasn't experienced already. And that's why I say about allocating exactly where your area of expertise is. You already know that as a parent, the most important thing you need to know about how to collaborate around that table. You can learn the rest, usually.
So what is the process to attaining an IEP? If you're kind of going into the school and you're seeing your kids struggle and they're not at the same level as all the other kids, what's kind of the process to kind of start getting your child help?
So there's a couple of different ways, and it doesn't have to be in school either. Services can start as early as even 18 months for, or even younger, depending on the nature of the disability. But somebody somewhere along this trajectory is going to identify that area of need, like you just said. It could be a teacher, it could be a community member, it could be a parent. It could even be the student sometimes. It doesn't have to be the parent. But the mandate under federal law says that all cases of known and suspected disability. So you don't even have to be sure. You can just say, you know what, my gut's telling me something's happening here and I don't know exactly what it is. That is sufficient evidence to go further.
Okay.
So depending on how an individual school sets it up, sometimes they will they'll bypass the step of making a collaborative team decision to pursue further testing. They will only do that in cases where it's just completely evident, no, we need to test this kid.
Okay.
It's a little bit rare, but typically speaking, a team convenes. It's called a local educational agency. A team convenes and says, do we all agree this is what we're seeing? Do we need to pursue testing? And if the answer to that is yes, then they will go to the next phase, which is that testing.
Okay.
Another team meeting to decide, do we think the testing shows us they're eligible for services? And if the answer to that is yes, then they go to the IEP.
Okay. All right. So, what might be some reasons that a school system may not grant the child an IEP?
So there are other ways to meet the needs of disability that don't rise to the level of IEP. One of them is called RTI, or now that I've said that, I forget the acronym. It's DC, and we all use acronyms. Response to intervention.
Okay.
Which is an initial phase by which a teacher can say, well, let's just try a few things and see what happens and see if this is developmental, because there's, especially with younger children, there's a wide variability.
Right.
And disability can be, from a very minimal thing to a very profound thing. And it can come and go, technically you qualify as having a disability if you break a leg.
Right.
But that heals. So anyway, the difference between an IEP and other services are specially designed instruction. Does the nature of your disability rise to the level that we have to alter the way we teach to you? If it doesn't come to that level, or if the team is sort of, we're not sure, there are a few things they can try first, and it's one of the ways that they might say not an IEP. One of the ways they do it that is, I hesitate to say it's inappropriate, but one of the things that you will see sometimes is they're getting good grades, so it's fine. They don't need help. And I mean, there's a lot of reasons why that's wrong, because there can be a lot of coping mechanisms in place that the kid can't sustain, or that they're working 10 times as hard. There's also environmental changes that don't rise to the level of IEP that can be very beneficial for certain disabilities, in particular ADHD. Not every student with ADHD needs explicit instruction in how to manage that. Some of them just need a quiet place to do their homework. They need preferential seating so that they don't have distractions in the classroom. That doesn't qualify as an IEP.
Right.
But it's still a disability that gets intervention. So those are some of the reasons. And then, of course, there's always those schools that are a little bit more resource poor, and they try to nudge the needle.
Yeah. So what do you think, IEPs fall short in?
I think often parental participation.
Okay.
I think parents think that the areas of the IEP where they need to invest are not necessarily the areas of the IEP that would most benefit a positive outcome. I don't think the IEP always falls short. I think sometimes managing and implementing that IEP with fidelity and understanding the data that the IEP is built to identify, those are some areas. So it's not necessarily the document itself as much as it is the way you work that document once it's in place. But for the IEP, I would say it's the voice of the parent. I think that the voices of the school-based members of the team tend to be the loudest because they're the ones that understand the process.
Right.
But I also think parents put disproportionate attention on the wrong sections of the document.
Okay. So ever since COVID, I've heard there's been definitely a rise in people fighting for IEPs, or people who already had one and they lost a lot of skill or whatnot. And so why do you think that is?
Because I think that the system was already broken, and COVID just forced us to pay closer attention to exactly the ways that it was. The system is built for a non-disabled student. And so nobody thought anything of, let's just put them on the computer. Why can't they do that? They will use computers at school. But there's all sorts of disabilities that don't support that access.
Right.
I also think that, everybody experienced a level of stress that we were unaccustomed to. And so we're seeing many more cases of school refusal and anxiety and mental health issues, which do qualify with a disability-based intervention. And then secondly, I think just, when I mentioned earlier about who and when the need for services is identified, those kids just weren't in the classroom. People didn't see the same things.
Right.
That's what I think.
Okay. So do you think, have you ever fought for or been in a meeting for dyslexic students in particular? So do you think, what do you notice kind of about IEPs with dyslexic students? Do you see like a trend?
One of the things that I notice is dyslexia is a little bit different from other disabilities in the sense that there is a very specific type of intervention that is known to be best practice. And we're not even talking about, good, better, best. We're talking about this is the thing that you do, that multisensory instruction.
Right.
A lot of schools, if they don't have appropriate training in those methodologies, will try to substitute more intensive reading instruction, which is not sufficient. It's not, it is apples and oranges. It is literally a different neurology that requires a different form of instruction. And so you can do more of the thing that isn't working, and it's still not going to work. 0 plus 0 is 0. And so I think sometimes when schools don't have the appropriate level of training on staff, that's where you fall into the trap of this is going to be a lot of wasted effort. And so it's really important for parents to ask about what is the level of training. Now, in an IEP, a parent can't go in and say, I want Wilson, for example, because there are other effective multisensory reading instructions that are approved for dyslexic students. But they can very much go in and say, this individual has to be qualified to instruct using a dyslexia-approved multisensory instruction. The other thing they'll say is, for example, using Wilson as the model, is there are tiers of qualifications under Wilson. So somebody can have Wilson training, but you have to know what level of Wilson training. It is not enough to have gone to a 6-hour, one-day staff training that qualifies you to do multisensory reading instruction for the entire classroom, if you're going to be delivering those students that service in small group or one-on-one. It's a different level of need. So a school can accurately say, oh yes, we do have a Wilson trained teacher. You got to dig a little more. There is an interesting program coming out. Well, it's out, but I've encountered it in Loudoun County, and I'm so intrigued by this, and I don't know a lot about it yet. It's relatively new. It's from University of Florida. It's called UFLI, U-F-L-I. And what's so interesting about it to me, and I suspect it will be approved for dyslexia after it's got a few years of practice, but what's so interesting about it to me is it's multisensory reading instruction for the whole class. See, because as I often encounter, is the things that support students with disabilities really benefit everybody. To varying degrees. And so I'm so interested by that. I have a client in Loudoun right now that was identified as dyslexic just this past spring, and did a lot of work because that school said, we have UFLI. And it's like, that's not approved, but let me dig further. And we're willing to give it a try and see if this is going to be enough for this kid. So that's something I have my eye on, but parents really need to understand not just which instructional methodology will be used, not to compel them one way or another, but to understand that it is one that is specifically approved for dyslexia intervention and the level of qualification that instructor has.
I use sounds and syllables, so it's like under Orton Gillingham, right? And so isn't it like the last resort kind of? That's what I've heard.
Well, I think as a last resort is different for every student, but I also think that there are different manifestations of dyslexia. and it can be very helpful for different subsets of that population, which clearly you've found. And that's why you can't necessarily compel a certain instructional methodologies, because teachers need to have a certain ability to pivot based on the needs of the student.
Right.
That being said, because you already have an established history that this program is what works for you, under the IEP process, you do have some claim to say, this is the one you should keep using.
Yeah.
And so there is a little bit of a caveat around you can't compel a certain instructional methodology. So having that history is very beneficial to know for the IEP team. If you were to go to another school tomorrow, what do they need to know about you as a learner?
So do you think, like, if building a case, for example, and we know that sounds and syllables works for me, and we're trying to push for that, but there's nobody else in the school that specifically has that level of training in sounds and syllables, that's a big, like,
and that's where an advocate would come in, because they know how to leverage that conversation appropriately. And that also draws on what I was saying earlier about parent input, because in that parent input is where you would demonstrate the data showing the other methodologies that have been attempted, the reasons why they did or did not work, why this one does work for you, the data around the progress you've made under it. Because you're building an environment by which, if the school says we're not going to do that, they have to defend why they've done that.
Yeah.
That parent input section of that document is the single most important section of the document because of exactly that.
Yeah. Yeah, right now we're pretty much at the defense area. We've been stuck there for a while.
Yeah.
But all right, so moving on to the Commonwealth Education Group. So did you start that specifically, or was it like a group?
No, I did. That's I even in my past career, it's just entrepreneurial nature. Maybe I just like being my own boss. I don't know. I think it's knowing the way you work, and I work very well by myself, for myself. Although, I partner in and out. That's why it's a group and not a solo practice, is I partner in and out for areas of expertise. I do have, although I do work on dyslexia cases, I have another advocate that I partner with occasionally, because she is specifically qualified on dyslexia.
Okay.
And vice versa. My specific area of expertise is complex communication needs. And so I consult with others on that. I also have other experts that I bring in for a variety of needs, like a school counselor or a psychologist, or, to consult on this is how you need to defend this type of disability. I'm an advocate in the IEP process, and the metaphor I always use is, I don't need to know how to fix my roof to hire somebody to fix my roof. I need to hire somebody. I need to know enough to know that the person I hired is qualified to fix my roof. And that's how I see myself as an advocate. I don't have to be the school psychologist. I just need to know enough about what they do that I know I'm getting good advice.
Okay. So at what point, like when they're in the IEP system, or even at the very beginning, should the parent start to look at an advocate and be like, okay, I need somebody else to help me. I have no idea what I'm doing.
Well, it's a personal decision, right? And I always say you should choose the advocate that if for some reason you couldn't be in the room, that that person is going to represent you, not just from a content perspective, but from a stylistic perspective in the way you're comfortable with. Because, I don't leave families better than I found them if I scorch the earth and then salt it so nothing else can grow there ever again. This is a community in which they have to continue to be effective after I'm gone. And so if now I could be good cop, bad cop, but if I alter that relationship negatively, then I haven't helped them. I've just created a different problem. When somebody comes in, in my experience, people who decide to hire an advocate often do so too late. And I'm challenged by trying to clean up a mess that maybe didn't have to happen. But also, me personally, and the way I work as an advocate, I'm very generous with my information, and I really do want families to be able to walk away being able to do it themselves. It's not in my interest or your interest that you continue to need me. I always say, I can show you the steps, but you can dance to your own music.
Okay.
And that's really what I do. Some families do want me there regularly. And I also think sometimes just the power dynamic shifts having another body there. So depending on the needs of a family, you know, I'm also working on products that will be available for free that will help families have just a better foundational knowledge in what they need to do. Every case is different, and I can't necessarily, you know, anticipate everything they might encounter. But I do believe that, you know, the best dispute you can have is the one you avoid. And the best way to avoid a dispute is to prepare as if you're going to have one.
Yeah. So, like, once you kind of made the decision to, I need to get an advocate, how in your practice do you get started with that?
So I always do an initial intake call where we talk about exactly what their needs are. And it's, you know, I'm used to doing these, so I can identify it pretty quickly. There is a subset of families that really just want to be validated on what their gut is already telling them.
Yeah.
And so occasionally that intake call is all they need, where I can say, you're on the right track. I'm telling you, you got this. It may not feel like it, but you're doing everything right.
Yeah.
Or sometimes it's a gut check. Like, you know, no, you're right. There is something going on there. You don't need me to tell you that. You already know. It is what it looks like to you. Because we can get in our own heads and question, you know, am I the crazy one? But so sometimes it stops there. I do occasionally talk to families that I will not take their case because I can tell from that interaction that they are, how do I put this? There are families that are so angry, and I understand it, I do, and what they want is somebody to scorch the earth, and it's just a mismatch in style, you know, and I understand that, and I know those advocates that I can refer them to, and they will have the representation that they seek. But it is a trusting relationship, a trusted relationship.
Yeah.
And so you have to have that energy match. And I don't take money just because I can. I take money because I have value to offer. So if the person is seeking something other than what I am, then I'm not the advocate for you. Occasionally people will call me and what they really need is legal advice. And there is a nuance between a non-attorney advocate versus a special education attorney, which we can talk about if you'd like. A lot of families, particularly in this area, you need a lawyer, you need a lawyer, you need a lawyer. No, you don't. If you bring a lawyer, sometimes they bring a lawyer. You know, it can raise the negative tension that in a way that doesn't help you. Now, I did have a special ed attorney in this area once say to me that was not their experience, that bringing in an attorney did not change the energy. And my response to that was, you know, with all due respect, have you ever entered the room that you weren't an attorney to know?
Yeah.
So I've done it both ways. I've done it three ways. I've done it as a parent, I've done it as a non-attorney advocate, and I've done it with an attorney.
Okay.
I'm telling you, the energy changes.
Yeah.
Now, you may want that.
Right.
You may want that energy change. I'm just saying if you do it a little too soon, sometimes you can avoid a dispute that didn't have to raise to that level. And it's not cheap. So there's merit there.
So what's the difference between just an advocate and then an attorney advocate?
So a special education attorney is qualified to interpret the law.
Okay.
A non-attorney, that's in simplest terms. A non-attorney advocate can tell you what the law says.
Okay.
But they cannot say, but this is what it means, or this is what will happen in court. This is what'll. The only difference with a non-attorney advocate versus an attorney in this state is that if you rise to the level of dispute that leads you to due process, you must have an attorney, because in Virginia, non-attorney advocates are not allowed to represent families. Families can represent themselves without help, which would not be wise. But if it goes to that level, you do need an attorney. Now, that's not true in every state. It is true in Virginia. It should be true in every state, because due process is, for all intents and purposes, it's a trial.
Yeah. So
you really should have that. In my opinion, you should have that legal representation. That's the basic difference. Other than that, there's really not a lot that a non-attorney advocate couldn't do if they were appropriately qualified. And you will see that every special education attorney practice in this area does have staff advocates that are not attorneys.
Okay.
So obviously it's
Right.
true, you know.
Yeah. So obviously it's a lot of work for not only the advocate but also the parent. So kind of informing the parent, like what would they kind of be going through if they kind of start going with their advocate into these meetings? What should the parent expect?
Again, it's different based on what the parent needs.
Mm-hmm.
I always defer to the parent because it's not what I want for that child. It's what that parent wants for that
Mm-hmm.
child. And I'm there to move that forward.
Mm-hmm.
And also, if I'm gone, I don't want them wondering, now who's this person now speaking for the child? We have to be clear, not just in practice, but in our intention that it's not my message. You know, and I've had teams tell me that throughout this whole conversation, even if I'm taking more of a leading role, I stop and I say, and what do you think? And I bring that parent in. Now, not every parent is comfortable speaking to a large group, and some of these teams are quite large.
Yeah.
It's just a public speaking issue. So sometimes they will say, you know, I want you to take more of an active role. Other times I'm there just to kind of fact check. I have a habit sometimes of, you know, I'll text the parent while we're sitting in the room, or I'll pass a note so that they know what I'm seeing, and I don't have to actually verbalize it. So it depends on what the client actually wants from me. I can take an active role. I can take more of a backseat role.
Okay.
I take a very active role behind the scenes, and I help prepare them for what to expect.
Okay. Yeah, that's a really smart way to do it now that I think about that. Because I kind of just think of like, if you're like in a courtroom, for example, you see the lawyer going at it and the client just like sitting there. But now that you like inform the client, that's like a really smart way to go.
I mean, it's a different environment to some extent because of that dynamic. And I would say that even that lawyer in that courtroom has had extensive conversations with that client, so they know what they're representing. And I do that as well. And in fact, just to follow up from your earlier question about starting that process, you know, if a client if we proceed to formalizing an advocate client relationship, I do a pretty deep dive on the records so that I can summarize the case and identify issues for the family that maybe they're not seeing from a very data-driven perspective. And it is very beneficial, for example, for me to, you know, meet that child on paper. And one of the gut checks I do is, you know, don't tell me that much about your kid quite yet. Let me read the documents, and then I'll reflect to you who the student is that I met. Okay. And if that doesn't match what you know about your child, then we need to fix the paperwork. If it does match, then we can go to the next phase and say, okay, how are we going to fix what we both agree is the issue? But that's part of that first process.
Right. Okay, so what toll do you think, you know, speaking from someone who obviously has plenty of experience, like a toll does this take on, like as a parent? Like, have you seen like a big toll?
Oh, well, I'm only 29, so again, what toll does it take? It ages you. I mean, it is, and parents will tell you this all the time, even me. Okay, so my almost 18-year-old just went through triennial reevaluation last winter into early spring. And I thought, oh man, I've been doing this for so many years now. I got this. I went in that room and I was the 2004 brand new parent all over again. It is you've heard the metaphor, having a child is like having your heart walk around outside your body.
Yeah.
Having a child with a disability is putting your heart into a hamburger grinder. And that's what IEP meetings put right in your face. Even the best of teams is tasked with talking about and perseverating on all the ways your child struggles. That's painful.
Yeah.
That's painful. Here's everything that your child can't do, and let's sit around a room and talk about everything that your child is having trouble with.
Right.
Oh, man.
Yeah. I mean, one of the meetings, it was just like a straight data meeting of an IE that we had all the testing, and my mom was just like, you don't need to go in for that, because like just seeing all that stuff and having people talk about, you know, your weaknesses, and that's like all they're talking about for 2 hours, like that hurts, you know.
And it doesn't help you either to paint a pretty picture on that and do a lot of talking about strengths.
Right.
Because your strengths aren't the way of the things you need help with.
Yeah.
They're important. They're important because they can be a pathway to remediating the things that aren't a strength. But you raise an interest. I have a question for you. At what point did you start participating in your own meetings?
I really started to participate last year at the very beginning of the school year, after COVID, when I started to see, like, because I went ninth grade, which was all virtual, everything was on the computer. And so, because I can't spell very well, like, at all, I would have the red line, I would click it, and it would be fine. But then as soon as I went back to school and we wrote everything on paper, I'm just like, this looks like a third grader. And so then I'm just like, this isn't right. I'm in high school and this does not look right. And so that's when there was a fire like lit in me. I need to go in there. I need to talk. I need to speak for myself.
Good for you.
Yeah.
That's huge. Now, I do think most families, because you talk about the sitting around talking about the ways that you struggle, how hard that is, it can be really hard to tell your child they have to participate. But I've seen it done as early as first grade brilliantly.
Wow.
I had a case in Alexandria City Schools last year that a young man that had Down syndrome as well as like he had another genetic rare disease, and it wasn't even the parent driving this process. It was the school that sat this young man down, days or weeks before the IEP meeting, and talk to him about, what do you love to do? What's hard for you when you're at school, in a very age appropriate way. And they put that together in a document. And it's a document that's available online from a site called imdetermined.org. It might be .com if you're watching this and you're looking for that, but it's I'm Determined. And it's called a one-pager. And they put pictures of him doing the things that he loved to do. And they put pictures of him doing the things that he finds difficult. And then that young man came to the IEP meeting and handed out copies of this document.
Wow.
And sat there while we talked about the things that he put on this document, and then he left. And what was so powerful about it was not only how early they had him take ownership that you identified as well, but it reminded everybody in that room, this is why we're here. He is why we're here.
Yeah.
Everything else we get caught up in, whether it's procedure or rules or laws or what have you, it all has to come back to that little boy.
Yeah.
It was powerful, and it was really wonderful, and I was so impressed with the team doing that.
Yeah, I guess that really humanizes it. Like, you have to realize this is a human with a soul, and this is who we're here for. You know?
Exactly.
One point that my mom brought up was like, you just see her as a number. I think they just see a lot of kids as like a number. Okay, next case, move on, right?
Yeah.
And they just want to get it over with, right? But these are humans. These are people who need to be treated with kindness and respect.
Exactly. Absolutely. They are, from the time an infant is, the doctor says it's boy or it's girl, whatever, they are a fully formed human individual with, dignity and should be conferred respect. And we live in a culture where, and when I say culture, I was thinking in my head the United States, but specifically Fairfax County, which, I call it the academic achievement bubble, the Fairfax academic achievement bubble. Occasionally I call it academic king of the hill, where you have to knock off somebody else to take the top spot. But it is very, very high performance driven. And so if you don't contribute to that, then you are the others. And I tell teams all the time, I even hand out stickers that say it. There is no them, there is only us.
Yeah. Yeah, that definitely. I mean, because people get like 4.5 GPAs. I mean, it's crazy.
Which isn't even a thing, by the way. It's a 4.0. I mean, it is a thing.
Oh, right.
But that's like saying 120%. Like, technically it's not a thing. Yeah. I mean, yes it is, but
it's crazy.
A couple years ago, I don't want to say a couple, it was a past school board. It wasn't the currently seated school board. And so it had to be at least 6 years ago, but there was a budget deficit. And the school board was talking about, what are we going to cut? And my school board member, who is no longer, they lost their election, so I don't want to throw that individual under the bus, but they sat up there and they said, they were talking about the fact that Fairfax at the time, paid all AP testing fees. Now, and they were saying, couldn't we, this individual, and I'm specifically not using gender, this individual said, couldn't we squeeze a little bit more out of special ed so that we can pay these AP testing fees? Now, bear in mind, low-income students still did what they were not at risk of having to pay their own AP testing fees.
Mm-hmm.
So if you qualify as a low-income student, this wasn't even at risk. This was only for the people who, in theory, could pay it themselves, and who, in theory, if they pass that test, are going to save a lot of money on college tuition. Mm-hmm. And do you know what the compromise was? We'll pay for 6 of them. Now, that alone, mm-hmm. like the fact that there's students who aren't covered by 6 AP testing fees, I mean, I get it. That's what we have here. And in many ways, that's fortunate because it's why we have such good schools. Mm-hmm. But sometimes I just feel like, do you realize as close as Loudoun County, even some parts of Fairfax County, we have food insecurity?
Yeah.
And you're talking about, we got to pay these AP testing fees. I'm sure it's a very real problem for some families. And it's but in the hierarchy of needs, wow, yeah. That's privilege.
Mm-hmm. Wow. That's not right. So I guess going back to you being an educational advocate, what limitations do you kind of have in the IEP system? Like, what's the point where you like kind of can't go any further?
Well, I told you I can't represent a due process. Mm-hmm. Now I have, I can consult with an attorney on a due process case. There are some limitations because bringing in a third party extends privilege. The privilege, the attorney-client privilege, does not extend to a third party. That there's ways to protect that. Theoretically, if I am under the supervision and have a contractual agreement with that attorney, but so I become their staff, in other words. But I think mostly separate from due process, it's more a case of you need an advocate that knows. I think one of the skills in life in general is knowing what you don't know.
Yeah.
Because the stakes are too high for me to fake it till I make it.
Right.
It is not right for me to accept money from you for my expertise if I am using you as a guinea pig to learn what I need to do.
Right.
That's not right. And it's not okay. But I think, we don't necessarily value people saying, I don't know that. Mm-hmm. That would be a place where I would stop. Now, for me personally, if I reach that point, I say, but here's somebody who does.
Right.
And that's why I'm a group, and that's why I have other people that I partner with. But I know advocates that'll just be like, well, I'll study this and I'll figure it out. I mean, I think that if you know advocacy, you are still coming in with skills to offer.
Right.
But that would be another area where I might stop. And then another area, and this is actually in my client agreements, is if the client behaves in a way that I can't effectively represent them.
Okay.
And that might mean they deliberately withhold information. It might mean they don't give me, they don't meet deadlines I have for being able to be an informed representative on their behalf. It might just mean, things they say and do behaviorally.
Yeah.
But if the way that they're acting prevents me from being effective on their behalf, there's, again, like I said earlier, I'm not taking money just because I can do it. I'm taking money because I know I'm good at what I do, and you're getting what you pay for. Right. I have no doubt about that. If anything happens that I can't honestly say that, that's when I would stop.
Okay. So I now know you've worked with students who have dyslexia. Just like ballpark, have you found them to be successful, or are they particularly hard? I know every case is different.
I would say I'd answer in the middle. I think they're more complicated than a lot of presentations of disability because I think it's one of those invisible disabilities that there's nothing about you that would inform me that you had that need.
Right.
And I hate to say that, what we see is what we believe, whether we're right or wrong.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people who legitimately qualify for a handicapped parking space, but they get the evil eye because they seem to be walking into the store just fine, and that's the kind of thing that I think is complicated.
Right.
And I think that, just the fact that there are different presentations of dyslexia. And I think people are unclear about exactly how we acquire the skills of reading if that came easily to us. We don't know what decoding and encoding are.
Right.
Decoding, is sounding out. Encoding is spelling.
Yeah.
They don't know what fluency is. They probably know what comprehension is.
Right.
So it's more complicated in that regard. It's less complicated in the sense that it's measurable.
Mm-hmm.
The data will show it
Yeah.
in testing, which that's not true of every disability.
Right.
It comes with known interventions. It's a widely acknowledged form of disability.
Mm-hmm.
Not every disability is.
Right.
So it's less complicated in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
If I were to say this student has dyslexia, a qualified teacher is going to be like, okay, I know what that means. I understand that's a word I've heard.
Mm-hmm.
And not every disability is that. So
right.
In that sense, it's less complicated.
Right. I know, like, I guess if you put in, like, have you heard of, like, the Lexile reading?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so, like, Lexile reading SOLs, like, I do very well on those, but that's only because I work so hard. I get really good grades, but that's only because I work so hard.
Mm-hmm.
If you were to look at, like, the little things, that's when you see these huge deficits. Yeah.
I think the world is going to be easier for you than it was for people of my age that had dyslexia. First of all, I think a lot of people had it and never knew because they didn't know the rest of the world wasn't experiencing what they were experiencing. All they knew, I'm not smart. Why am I having so much trouble when my friends aren't?
Mm-hmm.
I also think that the tools that are being put in place through technology are something that, we didn't have. And I don't just mean my age group, but until, the last decade. I remember when Fairfax County made the decision to have devices for everybody in school. That wasn't true as early as, 2004 when my son entered. He's not dyslexic, but my point is just, and I think the world's going that way where the technological tools available to you in your adult life as a working individual are more likely to be supportive of your needs than they ever have been before.
Yeah, definitely, like, audio, that's a huge thing.
And nobody blinks. It used to be a very big deal. Nobody blinks.
Yeah.
People listen to books on tape because they prefer it, not because they need it.
Yeah, and, like, then nobody ever has to know if you don't want people to know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So, if you were to, like, cap an average on how long a case might be, what would kind of be, like, the timeline for, like, average?
Well, because as we've said earlier, everybody's a human being, and human beings are very unpredictable little critters. It's very difficult to say because there are procedural timelines around when things have to happen, but typically speaking, that doesn't mean that's when they have to be completed. It means it's when they have to be started. So, for example, if I identified a student that possibly has a disability, there's X number of days until we have to go to further testing.
Right.
Once they decide they're going to testing, there's X number of days until we have to, review the results. There is a timeline around when they have to open an IEP, but there is no timeline around when they have to finish it.
Right.
And so, depending on how effective that communication is, that can really take a long time. And I've had some clients, that invest a lot of time on things that I don't personally think are the hill they should die on, but that's not up to me. And it does extend it quite a bit. And then there's those that just want that ongoing supervision too. So there isn't really an easy answer to that.
Yeah, I know, because there's so many parts to an IEP. I mean, like, the part where the hill you should die on, like, we ran into a situation with this certain goal, and it's like, should we, like, run this into the ground because we had other things on the agenda we needed to talk about, and that was one of the things we kind of just had to let go. It's that.
Well, and that's where, I think I have a lot of skill is I often say to families that, I have Henry Kissinger levels of diplomacy or Madeleine Albright, depending upon who you prefer. But, the diplomacy and the effective communication, many, many, many of my cases, probably 90% of my cases come down to some form of breakdown in mutual understanding of one another. And I often say I have to translate from parent ease to school ease and back again because you're saying the same thing, but you don't know it because you're using different verbiage to, or what is the concern behind what you're actually saying? So I would argue not even knowing what that goal was, you were of different minds about how it was being interpreted or whether it was necessary or how you were going to measure it. That's usually what it comes down to in some form.
Yeah.
And what I can bring to the table is, okay, school, this is the underlying motivation of why parent is concerned about this.
Yeah.
Parent, let me just translate the words they're using and what this looks like in practice. And then both sides go, oh, well, how are we going to put that into words on the paper then? Now we get it. And you really can waste a lot of time without that lens.
Yeah, I mean, they at least spend like a third of the meeting figuring out what to type because they're so specific about that wording. Like, I didn't think that was a big deal until I actually started sitting in those meetings, and they're just like, they're very particular about the wording because it is a legal document.
Correct. And it is true that the intent of a phrase can change with a comma, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, before that book came out, Eats, Shoots, and Leaves, you know that book?
I have not.
So it's a book called Eats, Shoots, and Leaves.
Okay.
And if I said that to you, what are you picturing?
Like, the first thing I thought about was like Chutes and Ladders, the game.
Okay. Perfect example. So the comma, placement or not, Eats, Shoots, and Leaves could be a panda that's eating shoots and leaves, meaning, you know, leaves and bamboo. Or it could be eats, comma, shoots, comma, and leave, meaning I'm having dinner, I'm firing a gun at you, and then I'm leaving the place. The comma changes the meaning. And you had a third meaning entirely, which isn't wrong either, right? So it matters. Like, those words matter. Now, the difference between a contract and an IEP is that an IEP is intended to be a rolling, living document. But intention matters too, because the whole point of an IEP is it's supposed to be understandable even if everybody in that room became somebody different the next day. An unknown reader should be able to read that document and know who you are and what you need as a learner. So we're all sitting around the room and saying, we understand this, but we have to be able to capture it in a way that somebody who doesn't understand it can come to understand it without us verbally explaining it. It's got to be evident.
Okay. So why do you think like dyslexia is like a common issue in the IEP system? Like, it's not being like taken care of, obviously.
Because we are very much behind the curve in our understanding of neurodiversity in all of its applications. It's a form of neurodiversity. And one of my unpopular opinions, and I respect anybody who doesn't view it this way, but, you know, neurological variation is a natural human variation. You know, the fact that you were born with wiring that makes you transpose letters or difficult to decode or what have you is no different from the fact that somebody else was born left-handed and somebody else was born. It's just a neurological variation. But we have identified that as the less than. And so, you know, I don't even like the term. In fact, I shouldn't say I don't like it. I abhor it. I despise it. People who say special needs. I don't despise the people. I despise the phrase. And I'll tell you why. Because, well, there's a number of reasons. One of them is the term special needs is not defined under the law. It means different things to different people. And it's not protected under the law. Disability is. So that word, you know, say whatever you want in the privacy of your home, but when you're at that IEP table, you use the word disability because it means something and it's protected. But the other reason is because my child's needs aren't special. His needs are to be educated, to be accepted, to be loved, to be included.
That's anybody's needs.
Thank you. And so by calling that special, we are otherizing him. Now, the supports and the interventions he needs in order to achieve education and inclusion, those things are different. But different is what they are, not special. You know, the otherization is part of the problem. But to answer your question, we have otherized neurological differences. And as we identify how many people actually have them, normal isn't a thing. Like I always say, you know, normal is a statistic, not a person. There's such a thing as a norm in statistics. It's never what a person is. There is no person walking the earth, in my opinion, that hits exactly at the normed level across all skills.
Everybody has a little something, whether it's like you need glasses or anything like that.
So that is why I think dyslexia is, as you say, is challenging, is that we culturally have not wrapped our head around neurodiversity, and it's caught up in that net.
Yeah. So, although every case is very different, oh wait, I asked that question before. Oh, but for example, like if there's one place where you start to see like pushback from an IEP team, specifically with dyslexic cases, like if you could like pinpoint where the IEP team starts to like push back, like for a certain program, like Wilson or whatever.
So I think what parents don't always recognize is what's in the IEP is legally compelled on the part of the team. And so I think where we get pushback is when a family says, for example, she doesn't need 2 hours, she needs 3 hours. And in my opinion, you may very well be right, but you're getting caught up on the wrong measurement metric. You should be measuring outcome, not the time it takes to reach that outcome.
Okay.
The other thing that I think in general parents get stuck on, and this isn't unique to dyslexia, but dyslexia is included in this, parents want what's best for the student.
Yeah.
And sadly, that is not what is mandated under the law. What is mandated under the law, the exact word is appropriate for the student.
Yeah.
In light of their unique needs. So, when you go into that meeting and you're saying, I want what's best, I want what's best, I want what's best.
Yeah.
In theory, everybody wants what's best. And it's also possible to say that the only thing that is appropriate is what's best. But it creates a barrier to mutual understanding. And so I always counsel families, say, do never use that word. Say, I only want what's appropriate. I only want what's appropriate for my child. Because like special needs, it brings them back to the mandate that they have.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter that what you're talking about is the same thing. What you call it matters. And that's an area that people get caught up. But when I mentioned earlier about focusing on the wrong parts of the IEP, that is a regular barrier right there. Is you might say, for example, because my student is dyslexic, they need pull-out instruction every day.
Yeah.
Because the best practice is, frequent intervention. And the school might say, we can't put it into the IEP that it's every day.
Right.
And then they get like this. But it's a breakdown in mutual understanding, because the reason the school can't put it in the IEP that way is because if there's a 2-hour delay and your pull-out time was first thing in the morning and they miss it, they have not fulfilled the terms of the IEP.
And then they can get sued.
So it's not that, right, well, theoretically, you wouldn't, again, that's not a hill to die on, but they're out of compliance. And so that's that breakdown in understanding, where if I were your mom and I was saying, no, she needs it every day, you're going to put it in there every day. We can't do that. We can put in 2.5 hours a week, and I'm telling you that that's half hour a day.
Right.
Same thing, different understanding, and that a lot happens there too.
Okay, and like speaking of the word appropriate, that made me remember FAPE, free and appropriate education.
Yes,
that is a big thing right now, at least that I'm dealing with.
Plate.
Really?
Yeah, actually, it hasn't come yet. I've ordered it. Yeah.
But so if you could kind of just like explain free and appropriate education and what that means in the IEP system.
So free and appropriate public education is the very specific mandate under the law. Now, it seems self-evident, but the way that it manifests in practice is what I said a moment ago about best versus appropriate. It was only as recently as, I can never remember if it's 2016 or 17, but a Supreme Court case that actually went a little further in documenting what constitutes appropriate. It used to be that very minimal progress was appropriate. Now it's actually, a more aggressive, there's a more aggressive standard to that. So appropriate has got a lot of room for interpretation.
Right.
Free is an area I encounter, which is interesting to me. So with students that have complex communication needs, families might say, he's using a particular device at school, now I have to buy that one for home. No. If he needs it, you get it.
Okay.
Or, for example, let's say a sign language interpreter. maybe, they don't have an interpreter that you feel is qualified. And so you feel the need that I got to pay for the interpreter to come. No. If that's what they need, they have to provide it. It has to be free to you.
Right.
And that includes, extracurricular. It includes if that is built around your unique needs. So, for example, they're required to make after school sports accessible. If that means they have to install ramps because one of the people who want to participate is in a wheelchair, doesn't matter that it's the football team.
Right.
And the likelihood of him being on the field is not high.
Right.
They have to do it. It's free. It is free. And it's interesting. You wouldn't think that that's something that is open to interpretation, but it is.
Yeah. A big thing that's open to interpretation is, for me, is like the appropriate part. There's very different views on what's appropriate and what's not appropriate.
And I think that gets into what you mentioned earlier about the school seeing you as a number, because they have some contradictory challenges where they are required to make data-driven and data-supported decisions.
Yeah.
You're not data. You're a person.
No.
So there is an inherent contradiction there, and it's not necessarily their fault.
Right.
But the data is really how you can determine appropriateness. Now, appropriate progress, that's a tricky area. But typically speaking, over time, you can start to measure, did she do better this year versus that year in terms of trajectory? And so what do we do differently? Why is that? Is there an academic gap growing or closing or remaining steady? There's ways to look at that.
Yeah. Okay. Do you feel that the IEP system is serving kids with disabilities well, especially those with dyslexia?
Well, now, comes into that same category as appropriate now, doesn't it? In some ways, yes, in that the structure is there, and I do believe that they implement the process in this area effectively. But in general, holistically, it is a deeply broken system. And I don't think that we are serving the students well that are more difficult to teach to in whatever capacity that may be. I don't really know how to answer that, because it is like appropriate.
Yeah. I think there was a law passed, was it one of a student, her mom is like a senator or something from Poplar Tree. She passed some kind of law to get like testing for Carrie Delaney.
Yeah, I know you meant. Yeah.
Can you explain that a little bit more?
To get testing?
Yeah, like just the law that she passed specifically, like what it does.
I'm not familiar with exactly the one that you're referring to. There have been a lot of changes, and I don't necessarily know which one it was that she championed.
Okay.
Interestingly, one of the things that comes up frequently is reducing the number of standardized tests that students have to take. And yet, if you look at the portion of the IEP that displays what standardized testing a student will take, that list is 3 times as long as it ever used to be. Because they used to only do SOL testing at the end of the year, and now they do Virginia growth assessments that come up quarterly. So, and I make that joke almost every meeting. It's like, that list right there is what it looks like when you let a politician decide that we need fewer tests. Because it went from 3 boxes to 9, or it went from 4 boxes to 12. It really is. I think that might have been part of it. I'm not entirely sure exactly what Carrie did. But I'll also say this, is that, the difference between state and federal, Government 101 is, the federal law supersedes all other law. States can confer more rights, but not fewer rights.
Okay.
A lot of the interpretation of federal special education law happens at the state, and it's why not every advocate works outside of their own state.
Okay.
Virginia is not known to have a lot of deviation from federal, but they do have one very, very important piece. And every time if an elected official runs on the platform that they want less regulation, and so they want to align Virginia law with federal law more closely in education, well, first of all, it won't happen because politicians never prioritize education.
Right.
Not in the way that matters to us anyway. But if that happens, I'll always say no, because Virginia is one of very few states that have a more overt parental consent law.
Okay.
That in Virginia, and you have never experienced this differently, when an IEP team reaches consensus, the IEP team can't do anything until the parent signs their consent.
Okay.
In most states, and I want to say Virginia is one of only 6 or 7 that has that. In most states, the IEP starts, whether the parent signs it or not. The parent has to actually file a particular form of dispute to withhold that IEP from starting. And it might seem like a little thing, but the way that parental consent right manifests in different ways is huge. But I'm going to go after this today and look at exactly what Carrie did. So because as I said, I've known a lot of changes come up. Yeah. I don't know which one was specific to her.
Yeah, I know because my mom talked about it, and she's just like, if I was born like now and went through the school system as an elementary school, I would have been taken care of. I would have been identified a lot earlier, and I would have gotten the remediation a lot younger, which would be a lot better, and I wouldn't be in the position that I am now. And so that's really good to hear that younger kids are starting to get that, but there's still so many kids that are older who are about to age out, and they're trying to fight for something and they're not getting it.
Yeah, I'm curious about that because it might have been, mandatory screening at an earlier age.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean now, in your mom's point of view, that just because she was screened doesn't mean back then she would have gotten the services she needed.
Right.
So it's easy to, rewrite history that way. It's also important to note that you don't age out of services at 18.
Okay.
You do if you graduate.
Right.
But if you don't get a standard diploma, you are qualified for services until 22 in Virginia. Federal law says age 21, but one of the ways that states have power is they have the power to interpret certain things and define them. So, for example, from the time that a student is deemed to require further testing, the school district has 65 days to complete that testing. Federal law doesn't say, is that calendar days, school days, business days, what have you. And that can make a big difference. In states where they define it as school days, if you identify a student in May, they may not be done till Thanksgiving.
Right.
Now, in Virginia, it's business days, which means that, 4th of July doesn't count, but the summer does.
Yeah.
And to that point, Virginia interprets age 21 as being the school year in which you turn 21. So my son, for example, his birthday's in October. And so the school year in which you turn 22.
Okay.
In the school year in which you are no longer 21, something like that. I can't remember it exactly. But he will qualify for services until he's on the far side of 22 as a result, because he's not going to get a standard diploma. He would be a rising senior this year. He's not going to get a standard diploma this year.
So I guess if you're in the fall, because I'm a September baby, so because I'm right before the cutoff, so I'm still 16. I will be 17 being a senior. So I went to kindergarten when I was like 4 years old. So definitely that was also another like barrier of they're just like, oh, she's just young,
Yeah.
But
nowadays families would hold you back and not put you in kindergarten that young. I mean, it was an option then, but nobody did it. Now it's a much more common thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think my mom, she asked, but every time they said no.
Interesting. Well, so and I don't know what the law said then. I know now it is absolutely a parent's right.
Oh, really?
Kindergarten's not mandatory in Virginia, and so she could have chosen not to enroll you. Now, when you did arrive, they could say you qualify to go in at first grade. That doesn't happen, though. Okay. It could have been a situation where if you were getting any kind of services, they might have said, you don't have to enter kindergarten, but you do have to leave where you are. You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here.
Right.
It might have been something like that, or they might have just been discouraging her. That could have been too.
She went to the principal, so it could have been discouragement. I'm not sure.
Is that when you lived here or someplace else?
Right here, yeah.
The principal I'm remembering from Poplar Tree?
Yeah.
She got bad advice.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
She absolutely had the right to wait.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting to hear now.
But not surprising, is it?
No, I'm not surprised by anything anymore.
Yep.
Yeah.
Me neither.
Yeah. So thank you so much for coming on. I definitely learned a lot from you. And
I learned from you.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you're the person that I do what I do for.
Yeah.
You know? I mean, that you're the reason. You're an example of the reason why I do what I do.
Yeah. I mean, it's like amazing. It makes me emotional because like you just like think of all the people out there and just it's like a lot of hurt that people are going through.
Well, I've heard it said at my advocacy conferences, advocacy work is civil rights work. And, I've never, to my knowledge, walked the earth as a person of color, but civil rights are civil rights and human rights are human rights. And, I don't pretend that I know that experience, but our family has absolutely experienced marginalization. We absolutely have experienced denial of rights. Absolutely, yes. And when I look at it through that lens, that this is human rights work and civil rights work, it's heavy work. I definitely have my days where I feel that weight, for sure.
Yeah, it's very deep. Because I feel like you feel that person's pain, especially when you have that experience in your back pocket of like what you went through. You feel that, and it hurts.
What I'm able to do is channel that into helping them.
Yeah.
The hard part for me, and a very dear friend of mine used this metaphor once, and it has just always stayed with me. You can't save all the puppies. And you want to, because they're puppies.
Right.
You can't live with yourself that you didn't save that puppy. It's a puppy. Who doesn't want to save the puppy?
Exactly.
But there's a metaphor in special ed about the starfish, and the kid who's thrown starfish back into the ocean, and they keep landing on the beach again, and his dad says to him, you can't save all the starfish, and he picks one up and he says, but I can save that one, and I can save that one, and I can save that one. And that's how I have to look at it. Some days I feel the loss of the puppies. Other days I think I saved a puppy.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I really
appreciate
it.
I'm impressed with this work you're doing.
Thank you.